Hey everyone, it's Chrono from the Headphone Show, and in today's video we'll be discussing the performance of the HD660s, which, having been introduced in 2017, makes it the latest addition to Sennheiser's extremely successful HD600 series. Of course, the HD600 and HD650 have been for nearly 2 decades considered by many, including myself, reference sound standards as well as favorites amongst listeners. Does the HD660s live up to that legacy? Let's find out. Okay, so let's start off by talking about the basics. The HD660s is an open-back dynamic headphone from Sennheiser that retails for an MSRP of $499. For power requirements, even though I think that these are fairly efficient at an impedance of 150 ohms and a sensitivity level of 104 dB, I am going to still recommend that you use a headphone amplifier with these. I got plenty of volume coming straight out of my MacBook and my phone. However, on those devices, the headphone's dynamic range sounded a little bit compressed to me, so I did think that there were benefits from a discrete headphone amplifier. Just keep in mind that it doesn't have to be the most powerful amp out there. Something like a Liquid Spark or a JDS Labs Atom will be more than enough to drive these cleanly. For accessories, the HD660's packaging is definitely on the minimalistic side, but you do get everything you need to start listening. Inside the box you'll find 2 cables, and while they're almost identical, they do differ in that one has a 1/4 inch termination, whilst the other one is 4.4 millimeter balanced. Now, I'm not usually one to complain about cables, but at 3 meters they're very long and they hold their form, making them awkward even for desktop use. Lastly, Sennheiser also includes a 1/4 inch to 3.5 millimeter adapter. Moving on to the 660s build, you can see that it sports a traditional HD600 series chassis, but in a slick all matte black finish. The body is constructed mainly out of plastic, but this still remains one of the most durable and reliable headphone designs I've seen. It's great, and I doubt these will give you quality issues down the road. The only part of this headphone that doesn't really hold up is the pads, as you'll likely have to swap these out every year or so if you want the headphone to continue delivering their intended sound. Like the build, comfort on this headphone is pretty good. Thanks to the mostly plastic construction, they're extremely light, only 260 grams or so. The pads use a fairly dense foam wrapped in very soft velour and are soft on the skin as well. I only wish they were a little wider, as some users' ears might touch the inner sides of the pads. The only real issue with comfort is that the clamp force out of the box is pretty vicious. Nonetheless, this can easily be fixed by stretching out the headband all the way and then gently flexing the part that extends. Okay, so now we get to talk about sound, and right away I'll say that the HD660s is my personal favorite headphone in the HD600 series. I think that for the music I listen to the most, which is classic rock, they sound really, really good. They're not perfect though, and I think more importantly when discussing the HD660s, there's the question of value, but I'll talk more about that closer to the conclusion of this video. For now, let's talk about sound. First up is the HD660s's bass, which, like on other HD600 series headphones, is the section of the frequency response where these are the most lacking. Before I get into why is that so, I'll talk about resolution, because I was actually fairly surprised with how well defined this headphone is in the lows. I thought that it was considerably more articulate than the HD650, HD600, and definitely more so than the HD58X. I didn't really think that they were all that far behind the DT1990 Pro in terms of detail for the bass. Now, where these are really disappointing is an extension, because they start to roll off very aggressively at around 80 Hz, so they don't really do much in the way of reproducing sub-bass when compared to things like the LCD1, Sundara, and DT1990 Pro, which all have great extension. The bass on these comes across as rather shallow, which is a common trait amongst the HD600 series headphones. So if you want bass, I don't really think that this is the best headphone for you. Moving on to mid-range, it's as expected from an HD600 series headphone, which is to say that the HD660s's mids are phenomenal. For my taste and preferences, I think that they're both very enjoyable and they adhere extremely closely, if not perfectly, to what I consider to be neutral sounding and for frequency response. I actually think that it's the best that they've been in the series, and the reason I say that is that, to me personally, even though they're all very similarly tuned, the HD600 and HD650's mid-range, particularly at around 3 to 3.5K, came across as a little forward or shouty, and I didn't find that to be the case at all on the HD660s. I actually think that it has a very smooth upper mid-range. The timbre is, like another headphones of this series, great. I think that is very natural and transparent sounding. So yeah, tonality and timbre, great. I also think that for detail retrieval and resolution, they perform really well. They're an upgrade, albeit a small one, over its predecessors, but I also thought that they performed better and they were cleaner in their delivery of the mids than the LCD1 Sundara and DT1990 Pro. So yeah, I think that the mid-range is definitely the best part of this headphone. Lastly, there's the highs on the HD660s, and although I found them to be the brightest of the HD600 series, I still thought that they were a little dark and warm sounding. For frequency response and tuning in the highs, I thought that they were, for the most part, very good. I do think that they're quite smooth. I don't think that people really find them fatiguing. For my preference, I wish that they had a bit more energy in the frequencies above 10K. They're slightly peaky at 12K, but then again, the frequencies after are slightly muted, so I wouldn't call this an airy headphone or one that really glistens in the upper treble. The only real issue I had was that there's this peak at 5.5K, and although it's very narrow, it does add this slightly congested, boxy tonality to the lower treble, and I think it's noticeable enough to where some listeners, particularly those who are coming from the 600 and 650, will be a little disappointed because it does make the HD660s sound slightly less natural than its predecessors. Aside from that, again, the tonality I find good. For resolution, I think that they're on par with the Hi-Fi Man Sundara, so that's very good. I did think that they were a little more detailed than the DT1990 Pro, but not quite as resolving as the LCD1. And compared to its predecessors, I do think that there's a very, very small upgrade in resolution here. So the treble, again, smooth, not something I find fatiguing, but do beware that, that 5.5K peak might make these sound a little unnatural. Moving on from frequency response to soundstage and imaging, I have to say that while I don't think that the soundstage here is particularly bigger than on the 600 or the 650, it does feel slightly cleaner. And the reason for that is that even though they leave just as much to be desired in terms of soundstage width, the imaging here is a little more precise. And I think that's because the front left and front right gap that the 600 series is infamous for, it's not quite as noticeable on this headphone. And the other thing is that they have a great ability to layer and separate instruments. So even though it's working with a very narrow soundstage, its ability to distinguish and clearly define all the different vocals and instruments within that soundstage is very good. So I really like that quality of the HD660s. Having said that though, I don't think that this would be my #1 recommendation for a soundstage reference or an open back gaming headphone. For all intents and purposes, they're still very narrow and the imaging is mostly a general direction rather than a precise location. Dynamics is another category where I think that the HD660s performs better than the 600 and 650. The 600 series isn't particularly known for being punchy, but I did think that these have a decent sense of punch and slam. I also think that the microdynamics give elements in the mix a good sense of presence and tension. However, I still think that headphones like the DT1990 Pro and Hi-Fi Man Sundara provide a much more energetic and engaging experience in that regard. Before we wrap up the video, I just wanted to quickly mention that, like for all the headphones that I review, I've made an EQ profile for the HD660s that seeks to bring it closer to my personal target, which is very similar to the Harman target curve, but more importantly, it fixes that peak at 5.5K, so it brings the tonality a lot more in line with the other Sennheiser headphones and makes it more natural sounding. So if you'd like to try that out, I'll leave the link in the description down below to a community post that I've made on the headphone forums that has all my EQ profiles there. So if you want to try it out, links in the description down below. To conclude this review of the HD660s, I really want to address the topic of value because even though I think it is an upgrade over its predecessors and I think it has an excellent tonality as well as good technical performance, I struggle to give it a strong recommendation at its MSRP of $499. And the main reason for that is actually Sennheiser's own HD6XX, which they make in collaboration with Massdrop. Those two headphones come in at nearly half the price of the 660s and deliver 80 to 90% of the same sound experience. And there's other headphones out there in the market like the Odyssey LC1 and the Hi-Fi Man Sundara that again are less expensive than the HD660s, but they do achieve tonal and technical performance parity or something very close to it. So yeah, it's a shame, I think, because the price tag on the HD660s is as big as a drawback. If it does come down in price to $399 like it did for the Sennheiser summer sale, I think that it becomes a lot more competitive, and overall I do think that it's a headphone that many people will enjoy. So hopefully it does get a price cut sometime in the future, but for now I do think that especially the HD600, because it gets very, very close to the 660s, is a much better option. Anyways, that's all I had to say today for the HD660s. I hope you enjoyed this video or found it helpful. If you did, do consider dropping a like and subscribe to the Headphone Show for more headphone and audio content. Until next time, this is Chrono signing off.